Welcome back, fancy folks. This is your host, the Fanciest Man of Cornwood, and I am back tonight with our second of our poll winners from last week. We actually had a tie in the poll for who would be the fancy tickler for this week, which is a video that comes out every Tuesday. But because we had a tie, we're going to double up on that this week and get kind of twice the fun out of it. Tonight we have the second one, which is, to me, one of the more unique commanders that we've seen from the last few sets. I love the fact that she's dealing with prime numbers, and we're going to take a look at her tonight. It is Zimone, All Questioning. For one generic, a green and a blue, this is a 1/1 legendary creature, human wizard. At the beginning of your instep, if a land entered the battlefield under your control this turn, and you control a prime number of lands, create Prim-Oh the Indivisible, a legendary 0/0 green and blue fractal creature token, then put that many +1/+1 counters on it. All right, and it's got a nice reminder text there for the first few prime numbers. And I think probably all the prime numbers that we'll be dealing with, although I believe there's one more after 31 that we're capable of hitting with the deck. But, beyond the fact that just we're dealing with prime numbers, and as someone that's always been kind of a nerd, I like that fact. I like we have a commander for prime numbers, even though it is becoming a meme that we literally have a commander for everything. But this one's fun, and Zimone has always been a character that I think, even though she's in Simic colors, we see tons and tons of powerful Simic commanders. It's a fun new character. Strixhaven is one of my favorite sets from the last few years to kind of introduce something new into Magic. I like where it took the color pairs and things like that. So I'm always happy to see another Zimone come into the fold, and I think we've managed to get really a couple of unique takes on Simic from those variants. So that makes me happy as well. Let's look at our strategy overview. So on the poll, I had mutate as kind of the theme for this deck, and even though we don't have a ton of mutate creatures because we just don't have that much of a breadth of options in the game just yet, I'm hoping we'll get another set that looks at mutate and kind of deals with mutate. I thought that made Ikoria such an iconic, kind of unique set, and I still love going back and trying to play draft or limited with that mutate mechanic. Just really fun. But we do have pretty much all of the creatures that we have access to, and luckily, because we're in Simic, we're in a color that gets, or two colors that get access to really, really good versions of that. And one of those is Auspicious Sterix here, which, of course, the more we mutate, the more we're flipping over permanents and putting those into play. It works really well with Zimone because we tend to get some lands that way, and we never mind putting lands out. It gets us closer to our next bigger prime number, which makes an even bigger creature. The other thing that is fantastic with Zimone and mutate is that even though we're making those legendary tokens, and we talked about this in the Kiora deck tech recently as well from Foundations, that can kind of be a red flag for building a commander, because of course once you have that legendary token out, if you try to make it again, you're going to have to choose one to keep, one to get rid of. This helps us get around that, because once you've mutated a creature, you get to choose which card involved in the mutation becomes the creature that's represented on the battlefield. And what I mean by that is once we mutate this Auspicious Sterix with one of our Prim-Oh the Indivisible tokens, we can put the Sterix on top, and from that point on, that creature is an Auspicious Sterix. It's no longer Prim-Oh the Indivisible. That's not its name. That's not its creature type, even though, if Prim-Oh had any abilities, it would get those abilities. And, even though that kind of made us sacrifice a bit of value in the Kiora deck by downgrading our 8/8s to smaller creatures, this is absolutely perfect for Prim-Oh, because what we're doing is replacing a 0/0 with the size of the mutate creature, and then we're putting those +1/+1 counters, keeping them on the same creature, so that we just have these massive, massive mutated creatures that are a lot of times coming with keywords. Obviously, they're coming with some kind of ability, but we have multiple ways to add flying via mutate. So the bigger and bigger versions of Prim-Oh we make, the more we're going to love mutating these creatures onto it and just making big, big threats right away. All right, and because we are dealing with +1/+1 counters, of course, we have lots of nice tools in Simic to take advantage of that. And we've got one pictured here in Herald of Secret Streams. This one can be really deadly, actually, once we're kind of getting toward the end of the game. We've got some opponents at lower life totals, because with all of the counters we're throwing around in this deck, it's probably going to make, if not all of our board, then 90% of our board unblockable. And we love seeing that. Now, I've also thrown in a kind of a sub-theme of returning creatures to hand. The intent is that we're going to be able to use this not just on our mutate creatures to kind of get them back into hand, get value from their mutate triggers again, but also on opponents' creatures. The crystal shard that's pictured here, this is more of an option that's repeatable to our own creatures. And the reason we don't mind losing those mutate, or losing the Prim-Oh tokens, is that we get our mutate creatures back. Whenever you return a mutate creature, you pick up that entire stack. So if we've managed to kind of mutate multiple creatures onto something, we can get that back at instant speed, keep those cards safe, and keep ourselves kind of safe from losing the value. But we also have the Ozolith. We have some ways to go ahead and benefit from those counters being on our creature even as it's leaving the battlefield. And so that is our intention with this deck, to get as much value off it as possible. We're ramping a lot, so we don't mind recasting spells necessarily. And if nothing else, we have an Ozolith out. Maybe we don't have a lot of mutate creatures in hand. You know, this is another way that we can get value from the counters on Prim-Oh before we make another one. All right, so let's look at our first example, which is, of course, kind of showcasing some of these mutate creatures. And I've picked out 3 examples here, but then also something we can throw in the deck to benefit each time we mutate. We have first Dreamtail Heron for 4 generic and a blue. This is a 3/4 creature elemental bird. It has mutate for 3 generic and a blue. It also has flying, and whenever this creature mutates, draw a card. Obviously, you know, the more that we can mutate onto the same creature with this, the more cards we're going to draw. But I also like that if we are kind of holding up a couple of mana for a protection spell to return creatures to hand, this is replacing itself in our hand as well. So we don't have to worry too much about losing value, and it gives evasion to one of our Prim-Oh tokens. The later in the game we get before we mutate this onto a Prim-Oh token, the better, because it will become a 3/4 plus however many counters we have managed to put on it, which with all the ramp we're running, the land ramp especially, we can get that number up fairly high. Next we have Gem Razor for 3 generic and a green. This is a 4/4 creature beast. It has mutate for 1 generic and 2 green, has reach and trample, and whenever this creature mutates, destroy target artifact or enchantment an opponent controls. This, along with another mutate creature that just destroys, I believe, non-land permanents, is going to give us lots of good removal options. Of course, again, we're running this sub-theme that we're going to look at here in a minute of returning creatures to hand, so we can just do this repeatedly as many times as we need to for kind of problem enchantments, problem artifacts, and we're going to try and use that to help control the board. Next, we have Migratory Greathorn for 3 generic and a green. This is a 3/4 creature beast. It has mutate as well for 2 generic and a green. Whenever this creature mutates, search your library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle your library. This is just another great land ramp piece. We love that we're able to both ramp and make a huge Prim-Oh token even better at the same time, especially if we have some way out to give it evasion or something like that, which we'll look at some ways for +1/+1 counters to make our creatures evasive. But just a great card in the deck, and along with all our land ramp spells, you know, one important factor of running those is that we get to control how many lands we have at the end of the turn. So, you know, for 2 generic and a green, and using a token that's out or using some other creature that's out, this could easily push us over the threshold to get to our next Prim-Oh token, which is what we're kind of driving toward in the deck. Next, we have Polywog Symbiote for 1 generic and a blue. It is a 1/3 creature frog. Each creature spell you cast costs 1 less to cast if it has mutate. So this will make those creatures cheaper. It also makes their mutate cost cheaper because, of course, that is an alternate casting cost. Whenever you cast a creature spell, if it has mutate, draw a card, then discard a card. Just a nice option to plop out on the battlefield. It's a kind of a backup target for mutate if we need to do that, but then it also lets us loot and filter our cards a bit as we're mutating. All right, next we're going to look at some of the benefits we can get from those +1/+1 counters being on our creatures. First, we have Armorcraft Judge for 3 generic and a green. It's a 3/3 creature elf artificer, so this isn't a mutate target if we need it. When Armorcraft Judge enters the battlefield, draw a card for each creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it. This is a fantastic card to pair with our kind of creature protection, creature return spells. The more mana that we build up, the more we're able to repeat this effect and just draw. And of course, in Simic colors, that's something we love to do. Bred for the Hunt, 1 generic, a green and a blue. This is an enchantment. Whenever a creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it deals combat damage to a player, you may draw a card. This is just really easy to trigger with all of our big tokens. After we get past kind of the 7-9 strength tokens, we're really making huge, tough to block things. So being able to just draw a card each time we connect with those is pretty great. And it's a May effect. So if we don't want to overload our hand, if we're already full up for a turn, then we don't have to. Innkeeper's Talent is next for 1 generic and a green. This is an enchantment class. So every time we pay a cost, we're going to gain a permanent level to the class. We have to do that as a sorcery, but we also get the ability that comes with it. At the beginning of combat on your turn, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. So we'll be doing that each time. Obviously, we don't mind more +1/+1 counters. But for 1 green, we can pump it to level 2. Permanents you control with counters on them have ward 1. Obviously, this helps us a little bit in protecting our token, Prim-Oh tokens and our mutated creatures with counters, things like that. But for 3 generic and a green, we can get it to level 3. If you would put 1 or more counters on a permanent or player, put twice that many of each of those kinds of counters on that permanent or player instead. So this just helps make gigantic tokens. Which, usually just kind of getting big dumb tokens wouldn't be amazing, but because we're mutating, because we're giving evasion in multiple ways, we have multiple creatures that give trample to all of our creatures with +1/+1 counters. It just makes this really, really powerful. And, yes, we could run Doubling Season. We could run some of these others that are more expensive and more kind of established in the format. I like that this is a little bit newer in that it brings some other minor kind of benefits with it as well. Really just for 1 more mana than a lot of those, or maybe 2. But next we have the Ozolith. This is the original kind of OG Ozolith. For 1 generic, this is a legendary artifact. Whenever a creature you control leaves the battlefield, if it had counters on it, put those counters on the Ozolith. At the beginning of combat on your turn, if the Ozolith has counters on it, you may move all counters from the Ozolith onto target creature. So as we're returning creatures to hand, this gets kind of silly really, really quickly because those Prim-Oh tokens just get massive. We can return those to hand, get back whatever creatures we've mutated onto them, but then also transfer their counters and just make an even bigger creature. What I like about this too, just thematically, it's obviously not something that helps the deck, but it's kind of neat that this is from Ikoria. Mutate originated in Ikoria, so I feel like it fits even more with the theme of the deck. But it's also just a really important cog. The earlier we can get this out, then the more that we can drive towards getting, multiple really large mutated creatures with evasion. Next, we have our theme of returning creatures. Again, we're going to be looking to return our own creatures quite a bit, but I like that these are also flexible in a lot of cases and can target our opponent's creatures in a pinch. First, we have Ether Mutation for 3 generic, a green and a blue. This is a sorcery. Return target creature to its owner's hand. Put X 1/1 green Saproling creature tokens onto the battlefield, where X is that creature's converted mana cost. So this works really well with Mutate because we're just going to kind of get progressively bigger and bigger mana costs as we mutate onto creatures. But this is also nice to target a really big threat of our opponents because not only do we return that creature to their hand, but we're going to get those Saproling tokens. And as you've seen, we have some ways to add +1/+1 counters to creatures. We do have some ways to make that into kind of our own small little army of Saprolings that are just going to get bigger and bigger over time. So that's fun as well. Next, we have Arrester's Admonition for 2 generic and a blue. This is an instant. Return target creature to its owner's hand. It does have addendum. If you cast this spell during your main phase, draw a card. So I like that we can use this on an opponent's creature if we want. If we do that on our turn, then we get to replace it immediately. But then we can also keep, obviously, the flexibility of doing this at instant speed and either using it on our own creature or using it on an opponent's creature. All right, we've got Erratic Portal next for 4 generic. This is an artifact. For 1 generic and tapping it, you can return target creature to its owner's hand unless its controller pays 1. Generally, we'll probably be using this to either protect our own creatures or kind of drive our engine forward and mutate more. However, I do think it's interesting that the number of times I've seen this kind of be able to used against a tapped out opponent is a lot higher than I would think. I would think that number, once it hits the battlefield, hovers pretty close to 0. Most opponents would be wary and kind of leave a mana open. But, if you are playing someone that doesn't run a ton of ramp or someone that just has been unlucky with their ramp, then this can really put opponents in an awkward position with how they're using their mana and how much they need to worry about being tapped out, especially outside of their own turn. Next, we have Portal of Sanctuary for 2 generic and a blue. This is an artifact. Also for 1 generic and tapping, like the portal, you can return target creature you control and each aura attached to it to their owner's hands. Activate this ability only during your turn. So this one doesn't have the flexibility of instant speed, but it does cost 1 less to get out to the battlefield, and it does provide the same benefit to our own creatures, which we are able to utilize. All right, last we're going to look at just a few pieces of our land ramp package. And what I'd really like to highlight is that a lot of these are going to give us flexibility in kind of when we play out the lands and when we get the effects from these. The reason for that is that obviously we want to be ending each of our turns with a prime number of lands as soon as Zimone is out. And this lets us help manipulate that and make sure that we have lands in hand. And we can get a large number out at once to kind of get up to those higher prime numbers as soon as possible. First, we've got Cultivate. I'm also going to include Kodama's Reach in this because they are functionally the same. The only difference is that Kodama's Reach is an arcane sorcery rather than just a sorcery, but both are sorceries. They search your library for up to 2 basic land cards, reveal those cards, put one onto the battlefield tapped and the other into your hand, then shuffle. We also have Colony Heart Expedition for 1 generic and a green. This is an enchantment. With landfall, whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you may put a quest counter on Colony Heart Expedition. And then we can remove 3 quest counters from Colony Heart Expedition and sacrifice it. Search your library for up to 2 basic land cards, put them onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. Again, we're almost always going to want to search for 2 lands, but being able to search for 1 in a pinch, if it's going to get you just one of those really large Prim-Oh tokens, is nice to have. I like the flexibility. Traverse the Outlands is our last one that we're highlighting for 4 generic and a green. This is a sorcery. Search your library for up to 8 basic land cards, where 8 is the greatest power among creatures you control. Put those cards onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. I love that this is up to X. We get to tailor it to just exactly the number we need to get to that next prime number. And this gets really kind of crazy quickly if we manage to get a Prim-Oh token out and then mutate one of these large creatures that kind of the mutate cost outweighs or it's better than the toughness and power that you're getting, especially the power, obviously. So, if we have a mutate creature for 5, but it has 6 power, and we can add tokens, or not tokens, but +1/+1 counters on top of that, and then cast this the next turn, then we are, looking at potentially a huge amount of lands, and then another huge token entering the battlefield on our turn. I can talk tonight. I'm going to do it. Anyway, that is a look at the deck. I really appreciate everyone, of course, that has stuck around. Appreciate you guys watching the content. I hope you're getting something from it. Feel free to show your appreciation by hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. Both help me out a ton. They also really do help provide motivation to keep making these videos and keep trying to bring something to the table for y'all. This is another in our Fancy Tickler series. We do have a poll up right now to determine which deck we're going to look at next Tuesday. So feel free to jump on over to the channel page and vote on that. If you've already done so, thank you so much for participating in those. It means a lot to me. Otherwise, thank you so much for stopping by. I appreciate it, and keep playing Commander.